Welcome to Season 2 of Healing the Tigress, a podcast of conversations and stories on Asian American Pacific Islander maternal mental health. We are your hosts, Peggy, a perinatal mental health therapist,
and Jasmine, a clinical pharmacist who is perinatal mental health certified. As Taiwanese American mothers who live through postpartum depression and anxiety, we felt like we didn't hear about other AAPI mothers struggling with their mental health in new motherhood. But we knew it couldn't just be us.
So we created this podcast because we hope that sharing these stories can start to break the stigma of mental health in our community and help heal the inner tigress in all AAPI parents.
Hello, listeners. May is one of the most exciting months for us because it is AAPI Heritage Month and also Maternal Mental Health Month. And what better cross-section to represent these things than our podcast? So I will be real honest and say that it has been a literal dream of mine to interview our guest today and bring her on for this special month because I have been such a big fan of hers and her book for so long. So it is my absolute pleasure to say that we have with us today Dr. Jenny Wang. And many of you probably already know Dr. Jenny, but for those of you who don't, I'm going to let Peggy tell you a few of the things that she is known for.
Dr. Jenny is a clinical psychologist, speaker, and author on the intersections of Asian American identity, mental health, and intergenerational trauma. She founded the Instagram community Asians for Mental Health, spearheaded several mental health directories like Asians for Mental Health Therapist Directory, and wrote a best-selling book in 2022 titled Permission to Come Home, Reclaiming Mental Health as Asian Americans. Dr. Jenny is also an advisor on the Mental Health Advocacy Board of Wondermind and on the Academic Advisory Board for the Asian American Foundation, focusing on AAPI youth mental health. She has been seen on Good Morning America, New York Times, The Today Show, NBC, NPR, and more.
Dr. Jenny, thank you so much for the honor of this conversation today. Would you mind kicking us off by telling our listeners a little bit more about your cultural background and where you are in your motherhood journey?
Ooh, that's a great question. Because I feel like that context setting is so important, especially as mothers, especially as Asian Americans. So I am a 1.5 generation Taiwanese American. I immigrated to the United States from Taiwan when I was 2 years old. And so it's funny because for most of my childhood, everybody would say, oh, but you're American. Right? Because you were so young when you came here. And yet, that being said, I think my Taiwanese heritage has been something that has been at times something I tried to hide, and at other times something I'm so deeply proud of, which I think weaves very nicely into that second question about motherhood journey, because I think part of my motherhood journey has also been my motherland journey and what that means to bring that identity to my children in a way that is free from shame, embarrassment, and racial trauma. And so that motherhood journey has carried me to now having a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old. And it has been the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, and yet the most meaningful and life-giving.
That's beautiful to hear because I can resonate with some of that in that I just took my daughter to Taiwan for the first time. And what you said about like connecting to your motherland too, like I'm also at this stage in my life, like so proud to be able to show her my mother's land. And I just can only hope that she can appreciate it with the same love that I have for it too.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of our listeners are tuning in for so many reasons, but part of it is focusing on a lot of the perinatal mental health disorders and that postpartum experience. And so we learned in the pre-interview questions with you that you may have experienced some postpartum depression with your second child. In hindsight, I'd love to hear more about what you were feeling and going through during this time and why you think it took you some time to really recognize that that's what you were going through.
Yeah, it was interesting because I had not experienced really strong postpartum symptoms with my eldest. And so when I had my second, I was like, oh, this will be easier. I know what to expect. I know what I'm getting into. And I think for me, one of the fundamental differences was that my second child really struggled with nursing, whereas I was able to nurse my first. It was difficult, but we were able to get a hang of it. And I think each time I would go into the pediatrician and he would get weighed and he would start falling off the weight curve, it was like I'm failing. Like that was the narrative. That was what was activated each time. And so as we were hitting 3 months, 4 months, I remember, times where I was like, I had mastitis. I was struggling with so much pain, yet my son wasn't feeding. And my pediatrician was so chill about it. And he never talked about supplementation. He was like, he's fine. He's fine. He's still happy. And he was a happy kid. He wasn't crying all the time. He was sleeping through the night. And so it was like all these contradictory indicators of what was working or not working. And so I think in kind of the deepest moments, there was a lot of identity wrapped up into, I'm not doing this right and something's wrong. And I'm getting all these data points that are telling me something's wrong, but nobody seems to think anything's wrong except for me. Mm-hmm. And I think in that time, I was feeling very isolated. I had 2 young kids. My partner went right back to work because he had to. And so there was a sense of, I should know how to do this. This is my second time being a mom. Why is this so hard? And so that cued in a lot of that self-criticism, that judgment of this is not as smooth as you thought it would be. There must be something that's wrong with you. And I think that self-criticism, of course, then brought on the sadness, the sense of alienation, the sense of I'm not good enough. And I think as a mother, that's yet another gold star that we can try to chase after. And I was failing, right? So it was really hard in those early months to see that was happening in a way from like a clinical lens, because it was like, but you're so used to grinding. Can't you just grind through this too? Having been through school and training and all these things, you just think if I just worked harder, I could fix it. And at some point, my mental health, I think, was just struggling so much that I was like, I just cannot continue nursing. I cannot kill myself pumping to get like an ounce or 2 for my son. And so the moment I made the decision to add formula and eventually transition fully to formula at 4 months, I felt like I could breathe for the first time. And I think I felt guilt and feeling ashamed that I couldn't provide for my son. And at the same time, I was like, I can't keep living like this either.
Your story parallels Jasmine's in so many ways. I was like watching Jasmine be like nodding and like, this sounds so familiar.
Yeah, a lot of those like deep, especially where you say like, yeah, I was able to power through school and I was able to do all these things, get through grad school, like just got to suck it up and get through it. But motherhood is not, it's not a gold star to achieve, like you were saying. And it's going to look different for everyone. So the parameters that we're trying to measure against each other are not the same. My story is different than someone else's story. My situation is different than someone else's story. But I think that pressure on ourselves that maybe we've either put on ourselves growing up or maybe our parents put on us lingers. And we're used to being perfectionistic. And when we can't attain that, I think that's when the depression starts to sort of settle in around you. And you don't even realize it's happening until, for me, I was very deep in it until I was like, I need help. And I heard a lot of this from you yourself. Your book is titled Permission to Come Home. And it's divided into 10 chapters to invite readers to grant themselves permissions. Things like permission to question, to feel, to rage, to say no, to take up space. And each of those titles alone, I can sort of already feel myself bristling and thinking, ooh, I have permission to do these things. And especially as a mother, you didn't write this in the lens of like for parents, but like even as a mother reading this, I'm like, wow, we get to have permission to do these things. And I know a lot of these permissions kind of layer on each other to do that inner work, but we have a lot of API parents who listen to this podcast. And so I'm curious, like, which of these permissions do you think might be the most important for a new mother to learn to grant herself to protect her mental peace in like this tumultuous postpartum period?
Yeah, I think one of the most foundational skills, especially for parenting, from infancy to even young adulthood in our kids, is permission to feel. Because I think that, especially in our culture, some of us were taught to value that emotional stoicism or strength, right? Like, you don't cry, you don't think about it, because if you think about it, it just makes it worse, right? And so there's a lot of that kind of dissociation or denial of emotional life as a coping mechanism. And for some of our parents, that might have worked for a season of life and not so much later. But I think to give our parents credit, maybe that was the best that they could do, given what they knew. And yet, I think our generation, and also, as we move forward, we're realizing that by cutting off that emotional life, you also don't have emotional depth. You don't have emotional connection. You also don't have that insight into your life as to what needs to change. And so when I think about parents, one of the hardest things is to hear your child cry. If they're screaming or wailing or in pain or in deep, deep sorrow, that is super activating for us. And even as I say it, I'm like getting emotional because I can think of those times where my child was hurt by someone or disappointed that they didn't get the thing they worked hard for. And I have to know how to regulate that emotion for myself such that I can hold space for my child. Otherwise, one, they feel like there's not enough room for their emotions to live and to be understood and to be processed and to be loved through. And so I think as parents, that is our ultimate gift that we can give our kids, is to be able to offer them ourselves as vessels. And I write about that in the book about containment, that we are merely loving and warm vessels for our kids to have the full range of emotional life such that one day they can become the vessel for themselves, right? But I think for a lot of us, especially if you had immigrant parents and times were tough, their vessels were full of their own struggles and suffering. And so for a lot of us, there wasn't room for us to exist in full form. And when there's not a safe place for those emotions to live, then we compartmentalize, we ignore or distract, we overachieve to not have to think about the hard emotions that live there.
I'm tearing up. I don't know. I just had to. And I'm nodding really hard because when I thought about it myself, about your book and what came up for me, actually what stood out was chapter 2, which is permission to feel. And what had really hit me hard was, like, you talk about the concept of 思苦, which is swallowing bitterness. And that to me just like set off a bell, like a light bulb when you said that, because I've always grown up hearing my mother talk about how being able to do that is a sign of strength, right? You just swallow it, just get on with it. It's like the Chinese way of saying, suck it up and don't feel. But I don't think I understood, and that may have worked for me most of my life, but I don't think I really understood how lonely and devastating that is until postpartum, when I was really drowning in my really severe postpartum depression, and just kept telling myself that if I couldn't suck it up and I couldn't get through this, then somehow I had failed to be a strong mother. And if I had learned how to feel, like you said, or get through the emotions, I think it might have been more helpful in being able to offload some of that. But in my head, I was just thinking, like, if my parents could suffer so hard coming over here with nothing but like 2 suitcases and maybe $500, somewhere totally foreign, and I'm in the comforts of my home with a supportive partner and everything, and I can't get through something as natural as new motherhood in the comforts of my own home, then who am I, to complain about it, right?
I also feel like we weren't modeled that or given the space. Dr. Jenny, as you've been saying, like we are able to do that for our kids now, trying to hold that space, and no one gave us that space to feel. Like immediately as you were talking, I was thinking about how I hear this a lot with my own mother and other Chinese mothers. When the baby's crying, they go holla, 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 right? And it's so dismissive.
Yeah.
And if you were to translate it, the baby's crying, you're like, okay. Like I don't even know how I translate it, but it's just very like, okay, enough.
You're good.
Okay.
You're good.
Exactly. It's like, you're good. I'm like, how do I translate holla? It's literally like, you're good. It's good. You're good. Like dismiss. And I would get triggered when my mom would say it to my baby, because I was like, no, it's not. It's not good. Like, tell him what he's feeling. Name it for him so he knows that this is a feeling you're feeling, and hold space for it.
Yeah. And, as we're talking about parenting, one of the things we were interested in talking to you about was the topic of sort of parenting and breaking these generational cycles, because we've seen that these parenting triggers can affect our mental health. So I actually think your whole book can be helpful in doing that inner work to breaking the sort of generational cycles, even though it's not marketed as a parenting book, but it's so many things. I feel like it almost should be like marketed for AAPI parents. But for those of us who may not, or listeners who may not have read the book yet, do you have maybe like a Spark Notes edition advice for AAPI parents on like how to start doing some of this inner work?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like what would be a Spark Notes version, right?
I'm glad you understand what Spark Notes is.
We're dating ourselves for sure.
Kids are like, huh?
What's Spark Notes?
Well, I mean, I think there's something about Asian culture, and not just Asian, many cultures feel this way, where in order to be a quote unquote good parent, it requires ultimate sacrifice of the self. And I almost feel like my book is trying to say, that's not going to work. Right? That like, ignore the fact that you're angry and resentful, that your life has been flipped upside down by having kids. And that's a very real reality too, right? Or try not to think of the fact that when your parents or in-laws criticize your parenting, that doesn't make you rage, right? And so in many ways, in the model that I had about what was a good Taiwanese American mother, I had none of these permissions, right? It was, you do what is utmost priority for your children because that's what your parents did for you and their parents did for them. It was the ultimate sacrifice to prove your love, was to set yourself ablaze to show how much you love your kids. And I think that is the fundamental error in how parenting affects our mental health, is we say, okay, they get the best bite of food. They get the first priority in every aspect of my life. They get to run the show emotionally, relationally, socially. And unfortunately, right, when it's modeled in that way, does that mean as parents, we are essentially invisible in this relationship until they're 18 and they leave the house and then I could reclaim my life, right? Or do we say, as a mother, I'm not the last, I'm an equal to every parent or every child in this family. And instead of expecting myself to give the utmost, I give what I have capacity for. And then I reach out to loving others for help. And I say, I have to work today and my children are sick and I have to call my parents or somebody to come watch my children. I think that It allows us to live in a way that preserves mental health sustainably over time. Because when we feel like we're always at the bottom, right, of consideration, of needs, of whatever it is that the family needs to invest in, if we're always sitting at the bottom, then what does that create in the inner child or the part of us that says, wait, but what about me? When do I get a pocket of time to work on my hobby? Or when do I get to see my friends for a moment? And I think that deep longing and those wishes often go unaddressed for a lot of parents because then they feel guilt. If I take a girls' trip with some friends, I'm leaving my kids behind. If I travel for work, I better not go for too long because my kids are waiting for me at home. And I think that the guilt will always be there, I think, if you're a parent. But we have to say to ourselves, how useful is that guilt in alignment with the values that I care about? And if we're working moms, then yeah, I value my career and I also value my children and family. And do I have to prove how much I love my kids by giving up my career or by working much less than I would like or giving up my ambitions? Or do we actually bring all the players to the table and say, how do we make this work? Because when I live in a multidimensional way, my kids also see me that way. And that is one of the most powerful gifts we can give to our kids.
I wonder if you can expand a little bit on that inner child piece, because I feel like this comes up a lot for new moms, that they don't even realize part of the parenting is also recognizing a lot of these unmet needs as an inner child. Tell us a little bit more about what that means, because I feel like most people hear that, they're like, what do you mean? What do you mean by inner child?
Yeah. So an analogy I try to use in my work with clients is imagine, right, King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, right? And at the round table, you have all these different archetypes or facets of yourself, right? You might have a warrior, and you have a wise sage, you have a altruist or helper, and one of the people sitting at the table is a childlike figure, right? The inner child, the part of you that is maybe a little impulsive, a little emotional, a little, I want everything to be about me. And at first glance, you'll be like, oh yeah, certain people at this table, they're better than these other ones, right? They deserve more say. They're wiser, they're smarter, they're more experienced. But I think the challenge of that is we overuse certain characters in our lives, right? And, I think about certain people where the one that always comes to play when an issue arises is the warrior. Everything's a fight. Everything needs to be approached with a very strong, dominant, aggressive mode, right? Or people where the helper mode comes up. And so they're like a helping, seeking radar. They're always looking for how they can be helpful so that their sense of identity is preserved and they feel valued, right? And so the inner child is the place in which we don't care about consequences. We don't worry about the future. We just want to feel good right here and right now. And you could say that this is the most immature of people sitting at the table, the least helpful one. But I often say that this is the one that is often the most silenced, the one that is never heard and always spoken over, the one that feels like they have to yell the loudest in order to get seen. And I think a lot of us, we felt that way as kids, perhaps. Maybe amongst siblings or large extended families or in very difficult contexts where you weren't seen. And so we say, hush to the child. And then we become the very productive one, the very achievement one, the super hyper independent one. And that's what we carry into adulthood as this is what makes me who I am. I only know this version of me. And all along, that child has been sitting at the table, still waiting, still wanting to be met in terms of their needs and wanting to be loved, even though they're seen as lesser than at this table, right? And so I think that inner child is the place where resentment builds. It's the place where we feel as though nobody hears us and cares. The one that says, I'm never going to get what I want, no matter how hard I try. And often that inner child represents often our deepest of wounds, the core ones that we talk about in CBT, right? I'm unlovable. I'm incompetent, right? I am, not capable of living amongst society and being valued and seen as worthy. And I would say until we can bring that inner child to the table and actually give them voice and have them be heard, because what's powerful is once the inner child is heard, it's instantly soothed, right? It's your child that's like, mommy, 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 mommy. And then you finally turn around and you're like, what's wrong? And they're just like, I have a cut on my finger. And even being able to say that out loud is healing. And so I think that inner child is the facet of our lives where we're most terrified to let it come to the surface. Because it's unruly. It's very passionate. It wants to rule the table. And I think in teaching clients how to navigate these figures, we realize that we can be the very parenting figures that we lacked in adulthood, right? That we can actually go back and heal that inner child without our parents often, because sometimes our parents can't reach us there. They'll never be able to touch that space. But now we are resourced to take care of that child for ourselves.
That might be the most beautiful way I've ever heard an inner child explained. And when you had said about how, like, if you keep putting off and self-martyring yourself until your kids are 18 and now they're gone. But then now they're gone and you're just like, I feel like all that resentment comes out then because you're like, I did all this for you. And that's where you kind of get into these conflicts with your adult children, right? Or I can sort of, maybe mirroring, I'm thinking about maybe my own personal experience, but it's like, your parents are, well, I did all this for you, right? And like, why don't you appreciate it? Like, you should be grateful, right? And but you don't, I don't feel like anyone really wants to come off that way. But if you don't get that outlet, then it comes out in some way. That resentment is going to explode somewhere. And I can see that buildup if you don't start to address it.
And I think it touches on a topic I mentioned in the book about a sense of indebtedness to our parents. And like, if you observe your parents sacrificing everything for you, as a child, you might also feel like now you owe them. And how much do we have to now pay back to clean the debt? Versus having a parent that says, I'm giving this to you freely, and I'm also saving parts of me for myself, and you owe me nothing. Because what I've given you, I have given it with no strings attached. I think that's a powerful gift to give to our kids.
Yeah. Yeah, I think your example was about how, like, our parents are always fighting for the bill, or someone gives you a present and it's like, oh, this was worth $100. I must return it in this amount at the very least, or if not more. And we grow up with this sort of like tit for tat kind of like mentality. But I love what you just sort of said or stated, that love should be unconditional, that there are these no strings attached. Yeah.
As Asian American moms, there's a balance of trying to preserve our family's culture, values, and history, and yet also parenting in a way that feels more authentic to our generation, that cares more about our children's mental well-being and resilience, kind of just what we were talking about, that like, how do we do that? But also like not minimizing some of the values that our culture brings. How do you think we can preserve these values from our ancestors in our kids with concepts like respect for elders or filial piety, and yet still balance it with modern day values like encouraging critical thinking, forming their own opinions, and speaking up for themselves, and not just like blindly doing something because your elder told you to?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. I think the way this manifests for each person will be different because we all value different things. But one tangible example that I still feel a lot of grief around is growing up. I went to Chinese school. It was just, you suffered through it. It was something you did, right? And nobody liked it, but you did it. And so when I had my kids, I started off speaking Mandarin with them since they were babies. And even my daughter didn't speak English until she was like 2.5 and started school. And so I was like, yes, we're going to instill this language because it's a tie to our culture. It's really important to me. And then pandemic hit and schools went virtual. And my daughter had always just kind of like tolerated going, but never really liked the teachers, never had really anything positive to say. But now I was hearing the teacher in my house, right? Like it was virtual. And I remember thinking for 2 hours straight, I can't listen to this teacher yell at my kids anymore. And it was the really old school, like Chinese school, right? It was the yelling. It was the trying to keep them on focus when they were just sitting in front of a computer. It was this really harsh kind of biting tone. And I just remember thinking like, if I can't sit through this as an adult, is it fair that I'm asking my child to do this? And so once the semester ended, we were like, we're done. We can't continue to put her in that kind of environment because fundamentally that's not how we teach our children in our home, right? And yeah, maybe you end up learning Chinese at the end of it, but at what cost and at what kind of experience, right? With a teacher, you know? And so we stopped, and we probably could have pursued it. I mean, it was in the middle of a pandemic. We maybe could have found a different teacher or private tutor. But in the midst of everything that was going on, we just kind of said, let's just table it. And so my daughter now is 12. She's turning 13 soon. And so we have not returned back to language lessons for our kids. And though I feel such deep sorrow about it because now my parents have to speak English to my kids, which is so fundamentally still feels wrong to this day, I also have to trust that we are sharing our culture and our pride in ways that are accessible to us, that maintain the relationships that we want with our kids, and that uphold the values that fundamentally we care about. So much so that I am willing to let go of the language piece and trust in the universe that if one day they want to pursue it, that they get to choose it for themselves versus being forcibly, right? Like made to do it. And that feels like the fundamental breaking of a cycle where we let go of force and use invitation, exploration, or even openness for them to say no as an option. And so I think for all of us, we kind of have to pick, right? What are the things that we value most? Is it the relationship with our child? And maybe the approach isn't going to look like how our parents did it, but could it be done in a way that at the very essence, our kid still sees us as the safe place and wants to come to us in struggle and hardship? And for me, that's it, right? That if this relationship is preserved, nothing else matters. And that's enough for me. And they may never be fluent or even proficient in Mandarin, and that's okay, you know?
That speaks to me a lot because I have the same struggle, and Peggy hears me talking about it to her like all the time. And I'm working through my own grief in this process because my daughter's in kindergarten right now. And I think I'm kind of at that same point you were at. We did our first year of Chinese school, and let's just say my daughter's the same way, where she's like, this is the one thing that she tolerates. Everything else I let her do is stuff she likes. I myself actually did enjoy Chinese school, but I'm probably one of those very weird oddballs that actually liked it. But in a way that like my dad made it very like entertaining, and he put in a lot of work to like make it interesting for me and to teach me and to sit with me. But that requires so much time, dedication, and intention. And I just feel like I don't have that kind of time or patience to do that. So again, giving us permission to do things differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also like that you were saying when it comes to the values, it's not like not specific to these things of like respect of elders or this, right? It's like values are a broader thing. And when I kind of dabble in some acceptance and commitment therapy with my clients, it's like, here's your list of values, right? And none of them are things like filial piety. It's things like achievement, authenticity. I like pulled up my little values list because I was like, wait, what are they? Contentment, compassion, honesty. These are broader ones which could encompass some of the ways that we were raised, but we get to embody them and however we feel like that makes sense, right? So if one of the values is respect, does it have to look the way we did growing up? What does respect look like? What does knowledge or wisdom, what do those things look like as what we parent? They can still be the same values that have been brought down from generation, but in our modern parenting with our children, it doesn't have to look the same, but it can still be those same values.
Yes, I agree. For example, like our kids, we expect them to greet their grandparents, like, hello, make eye contact, but we don't force them to hug them. We don't force them to physically engage in a certain way, right? And that's how we, have the value of them having autonomy over their body and their choices, while also balancing the acknowledgement is an important part of our family system and our culture. And so you at least acknowledge that someone is here and you greet them. So I love how you said that like the manifestation of these values can be self and family defined, and they don't have to look in the ways that perhaps we saw them as kids.
Also, like with Jasmine and your Chinese school experience too, like I see a value of you're teaching your daughter some like grit, like, okay, we'll try it. But also to, Dr. Jenny's point, like if she one day were to tell you, I can't do this anymore, I feel like you would probably be like, okay, I'm not going to force you, right? Like we tried it. Yeah. We'll find other ways. And she wants to learn Chinese, maybe there's other ways, and finding a balance that kind of lets her have some input. And there's that value. You're having your values while also being like, but your connection to your culture is still really important as well.
Right. Yeah. More to come on what our next plan is for next year. But I have to say that same thing like you said, Dr. Jenny, like if you couldn't sit through 2 hours of listening to this, and I sit with her in every Chinese class right now, as all the kindergartner parents sit with their kids. And I'm like, this is hard. And this is like work for me. I have to catch her up on all the makeup work. And I am counting down the days till this semester is over, because I'm like, I don't think I can do this anymore. What can we do differently? Right. So it's pivoting, and it's problem solving, and it's problem solving together with their input in mind. And that kind of leads me a little bit into our next question. So our podcast is called Healing the Tigress, as kind of that traditional Asian mom can be portrayed as this strict, achievement-oriented tiger mom, like from Amy Chua's book. And we're trying to heal from some of these themes of traditional Asian upbringing where our feelings are dismissed or suppressed. And what is prized is the achievements and the status and what we bring home, those gold stars. And you've mentioned to us that with that achievement-oriented background many of us grew up with, I'm going to quote, you said, it can be a daily fight to resist the impulses to judge or criticize our children's process as it unfolds. And that's something I find myself fighting a lot too. I try to praise the effort instead of the outcome, but it can feel a little bit unnatural sometimes because of the environment I was raised in. How do you recommend that one can strive to sort of resist these tiger mom impulses to judge or criticize our children?
I will have to admit, it is so hard.
Okay.
Right? Because I think, so it requires us to dismantle this idea that success looks a certain way, right? Which, I mean, having immigrant parents, success was like getting into a good college, getting a good job, being self-sustaining, right? And I think in the ways that I grew up, there was only like 2 or 3 paths for that to play out. And so I think one way that I soothe my anxiety about my kids not necessarily being on that very smooth path is recognizing that there are way more paths than I can even imagine, right? Because when we were growing up, like, we didn't even have iPhones. The internet was just invented. How could we even imagine that there'd be like influencers as a career or social media content creators as a career? We didn't even know. And so even in our space and time, we can't even envision the paths available for our children with AI and all these advancements in technology. We don't even know what career path is going to be lucrative or whatever, right? So I think I have to like soothe myself in saying I cannot control or even predict the outcome for my kids, right? But what I can do and what I can foster are things that will help with success on any of these paths, which is things like integrity, things like honesty, things like work ethic, right? Not feeling or not fearing failure, right? Ability to take risks in the face of a lot of trepidation. These will be versatile in whatever industry my children go into. And so I think that in order to counter the tiger mom mentality, which I think often is driven by our own anxiety and not by our kids, we have to remind ourselves that all we can control and do is to help our kids develop into individuals who will know how to face hardship, who will know how to face criticism, receive feedback, and work hard, right? And however they choose to take that toolkit of life skills is up to them, you know? And we also have to recognize that maybe we grew up in environments where like education was the only way. That's not true. And I'm sorry, like, you know, being people who are highly educated, like,
The trigger
awesome.
in me. What?
I know,
Okay.
right? We're all triggered, honestly, right? But it's like our children may never have the degrees that we have, and they will never have necessarily the education that we have. And it still doesn't mean that they're not going to be successful or more so than us, right? And so we have to recognize that then there are paths that are not based on traditional education. And I think that's really critical for certain parents to understand, because you might be raising the next Michelin star chef. You just don't know it yet, right? Or you might be raising somebody who's going to start a business that works in a whole industry we don't even know exists yet. But if we pigeonhole our kids to only one way of succeeding, we are limiting them in a way that we can't even see the consequences of. And so I think part of managing the tiger mom instinct is to recognize my anxiety, my fear, my worry, and also remind myself that, and my neighbor said this to me the other day, her kids are all in college. She goes, my kids they're steering their own ship. And we have always taken that approach in parenting. And this is the thing, right? I always say, type A parents rarely raise type A kids. And it's like, I feel called out saying that out loud, but think about it for a moment. If you are a type A parent, your child will never learn the type A skills that you so value because you will do it for them. And you will clear the path for them. In every turn and every step, you will organize, you will pick, you will choose, you will orchestrate, you will direct all of their life for them such that they never internalize themselves the skills that they need. And what that does is it robs their confidence and competency in life. So I'm kind of a forgetful person. I mean, it's not my best trait, but I'm just going to say it out loud. But because of this, my kids have adapted, and they are very good at remembering things on my behalf. Like my daughter will literally say, "Did you remember to sign my permission form?" And I'm like, "Oh, right. That's still there," you know? And so I think there's something to be said about, I mean, I'm not saying be totally forgetful with your kids, but there's something to be said about doing less for your kids so that your kids can learn how to do more for themselves and feel the pride that comes with that self-actualization.
Yeah, that pride piece, that sort of ownership of something they did. I'm reading The Self-Driven Child right now, and that's something they talk about too, where it's like kids need to feel like they accomplished something. If you do everything for them, they're never going to own that. You are robbing them of that experience. So everything you just said right there, I'm like, yeah, good reminders, because I am the type A parent.
And something I want to highlight too is like, you want to give your child the space to make their own decisions, because there's nothing more scary than sending your kid off at 18 to go to college and they don't know how to make and trust their own decision making. And if we make every decision for them, guess what becomes underdeveloped? Their decision making skill. Because part of decision making requires feedback loops to teach. Oh yeah, when I decided to wear my shoes the other way around to go to school, that didn't feel good and I didn't like it. So I'm not going to do that again, right? But without those feedback loops, because you tell them to do it the right way all the time, then when it's a totally novel problem to solve, they'll feel incapable of making the decision and testing the outcome and then internalizing the feedback loop.
So I'm going to pivot just a little bit, kind of still along the same lines, but you open your book with an introduction saying that you never had a mental health crisis or a major trauma that really spurred your interest or path into your field. Because I know you had switched from, was it like accounting business into psychology, but it was kind of a long journey for you to unlearn certain things and transform yourself into, being, you wanted to be a better mother, wife, psychologist, human being. And so for me, myself, when I read that too, like I kind of along the same lines where I never considered benefits of therapy, or I even thought that it could be beneficial to my mental health until I had a very severe episode of postpartum depression. This is what truly opened my eyes. And this crisis is kind of what's led me here today, why I want to help other mothers, especially AAPI moms, achieve better mental health during their perinatal journeys. But then I also think about like those people that didn't have a hard experience, or they might never have started on a mental wellness journey that I feel like I was almost like forced onto. But I do see the value in it now. So how do you think we can invite more AAPI folks to really look at their mental health with like this sort of compassionate eye, or prioritize it if they did not have a big crisis or a major traumatic event in their lives?
Yeah, such a great question, because I think our community, our culture, even just the general society thinks that mental health support is only in difficult times or crises, right? And we forget that the other side of the spectrum is growth orientation work, right? Where we work with clients who are not in distress. They don't have symptomatology. They just want to understand themselves better so that they can live a better version of themselves and build a better life than the great life that they already have, right? And so what's interesting is when people say, oh, I've never faced a mental health kind of crisis or difficulty, I'm like, I'm so glad, because I would never wish that on anyone.
Mm-hmm.
But you're still alive, meaning you haven't faced one yet. And what's interesting is I started that book in 2020, and the years that followed were the most traumatic years of my life. And so as I was writing the book, our family was going through a really difficult time, and my partner was very, very sick. And I still have trauma from what happened in that season of life. So it was like I was writing the book, and that's how the introduction started, because I could honestly say that in that moment that I hadn't had a mental health crisis moment. And yet by the time the book was done, I was in some of the deepest trauma and pain and depression of my life. And so when I think about the invitation to our community in terms of either accessing support or even just talking more openly about mental health, it is an invitation that is to say, your mental health exists whether you're conscious of it or not. And there are things that will prepare you and equip you to handle the very unusual and unexpected things that life throws your way. And having had that experience of understanding your triggers, understanding how you tend to cope, understanding your cognitive distortions, the ways you think about the world that do not serve you, sets you up on such a strong foundation. Not to say that things are not going to rock you. They absolutely will. But when you are rocked, you will have all these skills and tools available to you to cope, right? To rise to the stressor and rise to the occasion, to cope in a way that helps you still feel like you can breathe and you can live. But for people who have never done that type of work, have never recognized that mental health is a shapeable construct that can be strengthened or weakened, it may feel like you are completely blindsided, and it may feel like you cannot withstand the pressures of what unexpected things, right, happen. And so in a way, it's like buying insurance. You buy it hoping that nothing bad happens, but you do therapy hoping that nothing happens. But as I'm in my almost mid-40s, so the things happen. And in the 30 to 40 to 50 transition, you might go through the hardest heartache of your life, because many of us may lose our parents during that season. So how can we go into those seasons with a sense of like, we're all going to be just fine, when we know that the natural course of life is a lot of grief may hit us in that season? And so I think that it's not to say there's anything wrong. It's actually to say, let me find the skills and the tools and the ways of naming my experience that helps me make sense of difficulty and does not shake me to my core when bad things happen, because they will. And having seen so many clients through their therapy journey, and just recently having had a client go through one of the most kind of difficult seasons of her life, and she was like, I'm at peace. I'm okay. And it's because we did all of that pre-work so that I actually feel like I'm going to be okay, even though a lot of things have changed in my life.
Yeah. I think a really similar thing is like, we don't just go see a doctor when you have a major medical crisis and are hospitalized. You have had a doctor since you were a baby. You've had a doctor every step of your life. You're healthy. Great. Let's just check on some things. And then, when you're healthy, your doctor's like, don't forget to eat fruits and vegetables and exercise. I mean, I think I literally had a PCP tell me that. I was like, okay, cool, thanks. Right. But yeah, why do we need to wait for a mental health crisis to get help? Because when you're in the middle of it, how hard will that be?
Mm-hmm. And this is why I actually think it would be a great idea if everybody had a doctor and a therapist from young. Like when they're kids, you can even just like have them start on this path, because I feel like it's such good, like exposing them to the fact that they can like talk about these things and that they need to pay attention to these things, because it's like why do we have PE, right? Because we want kids to be active. We want them to be healthy. We want, adults to go to the gym. We want them to like keep up with their physical health. But why don't we have a preventative path for mental health? And we have to pick up the pieces when it's too late. This is the experience I got out of my journey, is that like, man, I wish I had done some of this pre-work. I know I work in the medical field, and still yet I felt very naive that I didn't truly understand how it can really affect you. And I just think it's, the way we were brought up, that we weren't really taught that this is something we need to value, because we just shove it down. It'll be okay if we just, suck it up and move forward. But I don't think that's the way anymore. And I don't think we want that way for our kids either.
Speaking of kids and mental health, as Jasmine just mentioned, we saw that you currently sit on the Academic Advisory Board for the Asian American Foundation and work with their research initiative focused on AAPI youth mental health. I think as millennial AAPI mothers, we are also highly invested in our AAPI children's mental health from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. What can you tell us about the work that you're doing to help better our AAPI youth's mental health? And what can we all start doing now to lay the foundation for better mental health in our children?
Yeah, so it was a really exciting project. It kind of started and lasted over 2 years. And so sitting on the academic advisory board, it was with a bunch of researchers from all other universities. And we were kind of tasked with kind of gut checking and going through the research kind of project construction, implementation, and kind of they would say, what do you think about this questionnaire? What do you think about how this is worded? Do you think children and teens will understand what this means? So really kind of helping give feedback and data points that would be helpful for the research team. What's exciting is that research project has been published and it's finished. And so you can go to the Asian American Foundation website, and I actually have a copy of it right here. It's called Beyond the Surface.
Ooh, we're going to link that.
The project. And what was very fascinating was that, and I have kind of the stats, so I'll share that with you, that 48% of AA-NHPI young people scored above the threshold for moderate depression.
Wow.
And this is when they use the PHQ-9, which is a very common, generally used questionnaire. And so it's interesting, right? You have almost 50% of AA-NHPI youth scoring in the moderate range, which would activate kind of a need for a referral or intervention or support. So I think we were talking about this because I'm going to be speaking on a panel about this research project for TAF. And one of the things I wanted to kind of help parents understand is that this may feel like all doom and gloom. This may feel scary, right? And to a certain extent, as a parent of a young preteen, this is kind of scary. At the same time, I also feel as though it is a yellow or orange flag that is saying, hey, pay attention, because it is happening now. And our youth need us now. This is not a topic we address when they're 15, 18, 24, or 30. This is something that they're living and breathing today, right? And so I hope that it is a call to action versus something that causes us to feel scared and then avoid. And what's promising is that 63% of these youth said that they had a conversation in the last year about their mental or emotional life with a counselor, social worker, therapist, or someone who specializes in mental health conversations, which I thought was promising. More than 50% said that they had, to a certain extent, seen or had a conversation with someone. And then when we think about the intersection of ethnic or racial identity and mental health, right? 93% of our youth said that they experienced at least one form of race-based discrimination in the last year. So a high percentage of our youth are feeling these racialized encounters. So not only is it a mental health, let's pay attention, But we also need to start developing our kids' identity in terms of who they are here in the States or whatever country you're in, and how to put language around racialized encounters, how to understand the factors of structural racism and all those things that impact them in their mental health, because they are feeling it, they are experiencing it in their everyday lives. Now, what's exciting is that 19% of these youth rated their mental health and emotional well-being as excellent. 50% said good. So more than 50% of our youth, despite having moderate symptomatology, they said that they were doing good to excellent. So notice that there's a discrepancy here now in the data. And we can hypothesize, but it also brings into question, what are these youth, how are they coping so that they can tell you they're doing good or excellent? And also, what are the symptomatology that they're perhaps normalizing or pushing off or ignoring to answer in this sort of way? And so I think there's a lot of potential here in terms of intervention on a parent level, school level, teacher level, mentor level. And I think one of the most powerful things we can do with our kids is to normalize conversation around mental well-being, right? Like when you sit down at the dinner table, you might even just do a gut check. How's everybody feeling on a scale of 0 to 10? Right? 10 being awesome, really excited, feeling very empowered. 0 being down in the dumps. I don't want to be here, right? Things are really hard. And I think a lot of families will use different language, right, to have those conversations. I think another thing too is to be honest with your kids when you're not feeling great either, right? So that modeling that we can offer our kids. And, you know, one of the organizations that I work with deeply is Creating Space, which is, you know, opening up these intergenerational conversations about mental health. And so we have actually an event coming up in June in the Bay Area, and we're having a parent and a teenager talk about mental health on stage and really kind of breaking down the process by which they sought help and they were able to communicate more effectively. And so I think as parents, it still comes back to being the vessel. Because if you can be a vessel for their emotions, you can certainly be a vessel for their mental health. And the thing that exacerbates mental health is to suffer in silence. And so I think we can all break the silence. And I think that would make a huge impact.
Wow, that's encouraging to hear. And I do feel like a lot of parents in our generation are trying to do some of this work on themselves and within their families, right? But I think a lot of this timing of youth mental health crisis, rise of social media, smartphones, all this stuff kind of interconnects. Peggy and I have talked about, you know, the Anxious Generation book and all these things too. And it is no one, I don't think I'm too surprised, but I think I'm also hopeful because I do think that parents are noticing. So these are great conversation starters and like to dive deeper into like what are you guys doing like in your community. And it is a community problem too, right? It's not just like an individual family problem. It's something to solve all sort of together. So thank you for sharing some of that. And we'll have to, if that is publicly available for people to read, we'll be happy to share that in our show notes. Yeah.
I'm also curious how much of it is also people weren't screening us when we were youth for depression. Like I never heard of a PHQ-9 until I worked in mental health. And how many of us might have been moderately depressed as teenagers and it went unnoticed. I had never talked to a school counselor in high school either. And yet there was no tools and resources. And now there are. And now kids even have the language to be able to recognize that. To, you know, the pros and cons of TikTok, one thing I am noticing is that there's just a lot of content out there for youth about mental health, whether it's like good or bad, but it's not as hard to find the language for young people now to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jenny, for your time. To wrap up our conversations, we always ask guests this one final question in the spirit of healing our inner tigress. We like our guests to reflect on current day you, looking back at some of your hardest times, what is something you would go back and tell her?
Such a great question. I think I would go back and tell her that you are a lot stronger than you feel right now. And that you don't know when, and you may not even be sure how, but you will walk out of this season of your life. And even at some point to this difficult time and say that it was a gift, which it isn't always. And I'm not trying to like toxic positivity our way out of it, but to realize that each day you get to wake up is already a gift. And that when this season ends, to remember all the people who helped you walk through it and reached out when you couldn't reach out.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to just let that sit, because those were, I think, probably healing to all of us. Often it's a very kind of, this too shall pass, because that's the phrase I kept clinging on to when I was in the hardest parts of my depression journey too, is that I didn't believe it at first, but looking back, like, it was a strong thing to cling on to, that like, this too will pass. This too shall pass. My OB kept saying it to me. So Dr. Jenny, thank you so much, so much for your time today and this wonderful conversation that went so deep. Literally, like I said, this was my dream to have you on our podcast, and we will be sure to link your book. For those of you who have not read it, it's really, like I said, it's not marketed for parents per se, but it's just, if you're an Asian American parent, though, I feel like there's so much you can glean from it. I think people probably know this, but where should people look if they want to find you and learn more about you?
Yeah, so I do have a social media account on Instagram, Asians for Mental Health. I will be honest, for my own piece, I've been on it less, which has been so freeing and wonderful for just being able to focus and do the work that I really care about. But you can also find me at jennywangphd.com, and there are ways to get connected, email and website information. And yeah, thank you, Peggy and Jasmine, for this lovely conversation. Thank you for opening up conversations that I think many of us needed to hear or are needing to hear right now about motherhood, as well as being from Asian American communities.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Healing the Tigress. The more we share these stories, the more we can help other AAPI mothers and partners. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to keep supporting this mission, please hit the subscribe button to the show and take a few seconds to leave a rating. An extra big thanks if you would also leave a review to boost our show visibility and help other AAPI folks find us.
You can also follow us on Instagram at Healing the Tigress, or even better, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Healing the Tigress podcast to support us more. Inside the Patreon, we will be offering more bonus episodes, sneak peeks, and a community for you to help shape our podcast too. Thanks for being here.
Healing the Tigress is produced and edited by Peggy and Jasmine.
Music for this show is remixed by Dr. Tony Huynh of Tony Mixes.
Our intro music is a cover of You and Me by Z Avi, played by our co-host Peggy.
Our outro music is a cover of Green Island Serenade, played by Jasmine's sister.
Cover art design is by Dr. Angela Chung.